Today we've got a matchup that we've been waiting a long time for, and we knew this day would come. This is the new versus the old, David versus Goliath. You know, rivals clash, and of course I'm talking about T1 versus Hanwha Life Esports. This was in the LCK Cup a little bit a while ago, but this is such a banger of a matchup. I took my time kind of like going over exactly specifically what the dynamics were in draft and how interesting that is, in my opinion, and what basically transpired in order to have such a banger of a series and have it really evolve throughout 5 games. And this is a great example of how draft can really evolve and how teams have been putting so much more pressure on themselves in order to really think about what they have to adapt from game to game and when they're really pushed to the limits. Like the coaching staff have to really cook, and players don't have time to really think about their adjustments because they're thinking about their adjustments in game. And I think this is a full great exploration of what Fearless Draft can do, and what better way than to explore it than with something like this. And this is a really good matchup between these two teams. Of course, there's a lot of lore behind it. Zeus, he's trying to get that get back against his old team. Who knows what really happened? What we have speculation as to what happened behind the scenes, but all the emotions are on the table now, right? We got Doran, his direct replacement, facing him off here, and we even have T1 experimenting a little bit more with subbing in Smash instead of Guma, trying to build out their entire program. So that's basically what happened here. So we're going to explore primarily from a Fearless Draft perspective because there's so much nuance already, and we're just going to talk a little bit about the implications for each game. So game one, a lot of different openers they could go for. It's obviously going to be the most standard draft because nothing's banned yet, right? Fearless hasn't come into full swing, and there's still a lot of implications between what Fearless can do and what strategies are possible, and I think teams are still hashing this out a lot, and I think it's not quite like set in stone at all. It's a brand new format, even though things like Academy have been running it for like a year. But we can talk about this first draft. So it starts off with a Jace opener. It's very classic, right, because of his ability to create that poke con, and then he can also flex into tank Jace. So T1 respond by going for a full forward comp, and they just establish the conditions right away. So they go via Aurora, right? And on this 1-2, it's technically a soft flex answer into the Jace, although like kind of not really. Your cash outs in this case, if you're T1, or like the Mbessa into the Jace, where you have guaranteed forward because you're looking for that Vi Mbessa combo. It's pretty solid, but I think this is where T1 have a little bit of an issue with this draft, because you can see the Aurora kind of bite them back a little bit. So you see the Xin Zhao response when the Azir, so it generates a decent amount of jungle pressure for Hanwha and lanes to kind of play through it, right? Because for as decent as Aurora is, she wasn't as strong as she is on release, so she doesn't have the same oomph and just ability to dominate lanes regardless whether or not on paper they're good for her. So it's just a classic forwards versus backwards type of composition. T1 are basically looking to get that lockdown as much as possible, and Hanwha are minimizing this as much as possible. And we also have the X factor, because we have teams, who knows, you can let certain picks through and just kind of force them out on purpose so that you can clear the field and then set yourself up for other future blind picks. This could be me overcooking, but this is a possible strategy that I don't think is fully fleshed out and explored yet. So essentially that's what the case is here. And overall, it's not that the T1 comp is not cohesive, it's that they gave Hanwha a lot of time to basically tailor pick and cherry pick the best champions in order to answer what they're going for. So you can kind of see this in the game a little bit as well. So essentially, what T1 need to do is cause a lot of chaos here, right? And they're trying to find their angles as much as possible. But clearly, as you can see how it played out in the early game here, there's a little bit of a little bit of an issue, a little bit of a mishap in the early phases, so that Yezreal gets a little bit ahead, and Hanwha just basically do a really good job of minimizing this entire game. So if I go to like the highlights here, I believe this is the first game. Basically, like nothing happens for like 20 minutes straight, which on paper is like, well, T1 didn't necessarily throw away any advantages, but that's not the point here, right? T1 are looking to actively seek advantages because of the way their comp works. They're going to get outscaled. They have champs that thrive in chaos, and they need to cause that chaos in order to really blow the game open, right? Their currency is worth a little bit less because they have to be more creative in fights, and they have very specific target selection, right? And you can see them trying, but overall, like, not much is actually happening, ironically enough, for how much T1 are trying. They just can't find their angles, and Hanwhas are just completely suppressing them until basically 21 minutes, where something is forced, because Hanwha basically play with this sort of advantage in conditions for the entire game. I basically give no room for T1 to strike because they refuse to strike unless the conditions are good. But now with something like Otacon, it gives T1 an ultimatum to, you're like, well, you're never going to get good conditions, and we're going to get something if you don't take them. So we're just going to force you to take a bad fight. And basically that's what happens. HLE are already like ahead at this point, and like T1 are essentially already out of the game by this point because they don't find any timers at this point, like at this stage in the game. It's like too little too late because Hanwha have already hit their strides, and it was lost in the 15-minute lull period, right? So all good. What are the implications for this draft? If we jumped over to this next draft. So basically, if you see what the field is gone, a lot of the good poke options are gone with the Ezreal and the Jace. Actually, let's get a little bit of a snapshot of the draft at this point. So I have screenshots basically for each stage as they're banned. So you can see in the soft red here, these are the champions that are banned. This is overall the champion field. I do have the proper list of the entire list of champions as they were banned throughout the series. So I think thinking it out in my head, this is probably the best way to kind of approach draft if you're coaches. I don't know what the UI is internally on the Riot side and like what the client is. Hopefully it's like really simple and then the champions just grayed out and it's like really clear. But if I'm coaching staff, I want to see like things like this. I want to see the field. I want to see what options I have, what my players can cook. I think that's a really important way to kind of visualize and understand like what your next strategy is for draft, right? So if it were me, let's look here. Oh, there's a lot of the guaranteed forward champions are now out of the game. So there's a much bigger emphasis on getting like quality engages, just front to back, being really creative. Not in the sense of like just forcing your target, but creative in the sense of like coming up with compositions that can solve these solutions, right? We still have a lot of front to back. There's still some poke options in the mix. I believe Varus is still in. Corki is still in as well. So there's still some mix here, right? But however, there's still a lot of room for both teams to kind of play around with the draft. So the options are pretty much like pretty solid here, and for both teams still. So remaining OP picks though. Let's use this picture actually. Remaining OP picks here, highlighted in green, are going to be the ones to think about, right? Whatever's left and whatever's not banned still by either of these teams, they're going to be hot off the press, right? So you can see that here. T1 go for a Rumble opener on one. Understandable because they want that priority. They really value that, getting an advantage. So they pre-pick that, and as you can see from this state, if you see Rumble, he's probably the best champ left. He will guarantee good matchups into most of the remaining meta top laners in the game, right? We also have to factor in that some players will play like creative picks, and there's other things in the meta like that I didn't put in this screenshot, like spoilers for some of the other picks later on, but you know what I'm saying, right? So Hanwha end up responding with the Ashe Cassante, which on paper is pretty solid because they take the 80 carry cherry pick, but they exchange it for like a diluting sort of top laner. So this gives T1 enough room to kind of respond, but it leaves themselves a little bit open in terms of the picks they go for. I liked a little bit of the non-answer with the Victor as well as the Wukong, but and you can see how creative Hanwha are trying to get here. So when you see this draft kind of entirely play out, it's like kind of weird actually, because when you see it on paper, it makes more sense that Hanwha can gain an advantage here. I would argue it's a 60-40 draft, right? T1's responses were a little bit funny, right? So we can see on paper that like, okay, this Rumble into Cassante is pretty solid. They have Victor, they have Wukong, they have solid team fighting. They go Jhin into Ashe as a counter pick, but then they're picking into some tanks and they get out of range, and then they have to go Poppy. they feel like they have to go Poppy but into a comp like this, but then they don't have the agency in order to really start the fights. So I'm surprised they go for like a backwards pick like this, right? That's totally okay, because sometimes T1 is a team that doesn't draft with the most sense, but it makes sense for them because their level of execution is so high. So it doesn't really matter, right? Like they are one of the few teams that draft based on like their ability to execute, and it gives them unique opportunities that not many other teams have. And it's what a lot of teams strive for, because when you are able to execute at that level, then you're able to just still gain an advantage and get away with illegal drafts. I'm thinking like T1 versus Weibo draft, where they pick like Ari Lee Sin and just go straight like straight high mobility, high execution level champs, and that's that, right? So if you jump into the game, they understand that they do get outscaled here, but I think part of what makes draft good is your ability to adapt and identify what your draft gives you in terms of solutions, right? So you can see, yes, Hanwha, they outscale on paper. Their team comp is easier to execute, but T1 can be more creative with the way they execute their fights. So they can adjust their pacing accordingly, right? They utilize the strengths of their comp, which is the early game power and skirmish. Champions like Poppy and Jin and Wukong and Rumble, like they're going to be very strong, right? And Hanwha don't really want that game to be that fast and that strong, just like the last game, right? But T1 are not down for that, so they're just like, let's make it a shit show. And a shit show it is, right? But they love this sort of chaos, because in these micro adjustments and these little bit of judgment, these minute decisions, they're able to really come out on top and force an advantage and not let the game to get to that point. It's a similar version, a slightly toned down version of what happened in the first game, but this time they're able to get much more secure conditions and really secure themselves, proper bit in the game. So I'm going to quickly move on to game 3, where a lot of the priority picks are now gone, but teams are going to be a lot more creative, right? This is where it gets pretty funny. You can see there's a freaking Lee Sin ban. Like, like Hanwha are like very specific about what they're going for here. I honestly wasn't even 100% sure, like, as to why they banned Lee Sin. Even to this day, right? I was trying to sit down and figure it out. Who knows? What their jungle matchup was, right? So, despite this, T1 still have to ban priority picks like Kalista and Skarner. So I think being able to think about your current draft based on what your next side could be is a potential adjustment for both of these teams, where you're like, I can let both of these champs up, then force it so that when we are red, then we don't have to deal with this anymore, essentially. So T1 don't have many, like, let's say, negotiable bans, because these two are essentially mandatory. They don't want to give either of them B1, and then they were pretty allergic to Yone this entire series. So in exchange, they give up the Varus, but they have a prepared pick. But you can start to see the scrappiness of these drafts come through. So they go for Sejuani, which is one of the remaining blinds in terms of jungle. Makes sense. And then they have a prepared pick. They go MF into Varus. Not bad, right? So then Hanwha, they actually respond with pretty solid laners still. So Sylas into Gnar. The Sylas is blind, but in the context of the ults that they are given, it's pretty solid. And I really like the T1 ambitious cooking here with the Mel. So, like, not to say that it was good, but to say that I acknowledge the effort. So technically speaking, this is a Mel flex, and although it's very unlikely that it's support, it is possible. And thinking about the matchup that they were going for into the Sylas as well, it would have to be a flex, because I don't really think this was that good of a counter pick. On paper, maybe because of the ultimate, but I'm sure there are other picks that they could have gone for as well in the slot, but I guess they decided to reserve them, right? What's also really cool is that they actually planned out all the way back to R4 with the Sejuani into Irelia. Maybe they identified that one of the remaining picks for Zeus was actually the Gnar in terms of a blind pick. So that's actually a really smart adaptation. I do really like this a lot. And then pushing the support mid flex to 5. I could be yapping here in terms of that. And you can see another response. I think this is a really good snap adjustment to the MF pick. You can see this is like Walmart Braum almost, where you can go... If you go Pantheon into the MF, it counters the ultimate. It gives you the pacing you need, the winning lane you need, and they pair it up with an Italy. So it's really solid. And you can see T1, look, who knows who it is, right? You can go Mel into the Panth, but they actually end up going for LeBlanc support. Because on paper, if you were just going to go LeBlanc anyway into Sylas, which is actually pretty solid, you could have went LeBlanc on 3, and then you could do LeBlanc flex. I actually think that would have been stronger. But psych, it didn't always work like that. So I think if there's any adjustment that they could have done, it would have been that. But it's kind of weird because it doesn't really the Mel cuts off more of your options than you think, and that's why I wasn't the biggest fan of this flex, even though it was really funny to watch. I also wanted to point out this quick banger, if I can find it. I think Faker almost kills himself. He does kill himself at one point, right here. So you can see the matchup actually like not play out too solidly, because like if you see here, he W's the Silas E2, so he actually ends up forcing himself into a bad spot and killing himself. It's a rare fumble from Faker, in my opinion, and I think it's pretty funny. So, all right, bit of a tosser from T1, let's just say, right? They end up losing this one, a little bit awkward, all good, right? All right, so game 4, new draft, we're back, right? And I'll show you the current field at this point. And at this point, you can't even trust that teams are going to have picks that are considered in the meta anymore, because that's part of what makes it fun, right? Like they're gonna bust out things that no one expects, and I think that's genuinely a very important characteristic. So at this point, you can see a lot of the main field is gone. We still have some decently priority picks, like Skarner and Callista have not been going through this entire series. Corki has not been picked yet, could be by coincidence, and then some of the various champions have been removed as well. So it gets really raw at this point, right? It's just about picking your best blinds, forcing as many winning lanes as possible, while being able to have as many flexible comps as possible, right? Unless you specifically see that a certain set of champions has been removed that allows illegal blinds. So let's say all the engage has been removed and there's not many options left in terms of team fighting. So there could be a world, an insane world, where you could B1 Ziggs, because let's say there's no answer in terms of lane matchups and composition, and if you can just neutralize lane. I think this is something that this is where the nuance of these drafts can really come in, and it's on coaching staff to really identify and you make the most of these players, and also on the players to be able to kind of lean into that and be willing to adjust, right? So it's a Caitlyn draft. You can see because the support pool is so choked, there's not actually many good forward options anymore. So Hanwha ended up going for Corki Elise. So in this case, while Elise is a good champion in a vacuum for a lot of these matchups, you can see that's why there's a bit of a tech ban here from T1 going for the Nautilus ban, because that's probably one of the best sort of engaged supports remaining. Alistar's gone, Pyke's gone, Leona's gone, right? There's Rakan, but it would have fared really poorly into the strategy that T1 we're going for. So there's basically no champs left. And if they don't pick Elise here, Elise is probably going to get banned, and then boom, not many options left, right? So, whoa, you can see T1, pretty strong lanes all around. You have the fabled 3 winning lanes, right? Basically all blinds too, and it doesn't really matter because I think a team like this, T1 have done drafts exactly like this. But really sick on Hanwha to really find champions that can still work. They go the Aatrox into Jax. It's a very Zeus type of matchup, I would say. It's a Zeus sort of answer. But the Diana Yasuo is where it gets really spicy. I think it's a very creative answer. So, you can see the adaptations coming through. And this game is quite chaotic, I would say, and which is natural because of how tight the champion pools are. Teams are getting pretty frantic right now. It just naturally gets more scrappy because teams are not used to the champions they play. But because T1 were able to get such an advantage in terms of draft, in my opinion, in this game, then it's really easy for them to just kind of force things and have favorable fights. Game 5. Oh man, you can really see both teams stretch to the limits in this game because there's so many champs that are just gone, and I don't even need to cover the pool because basically everything's gone. But what is interesting is that both Skarner and Callista are open, and both teams basically signed up for it, right? T1, it's because the alternative was T1 banning both of them, but T1 refused to ban both, right? So you just ban neither, and because you ban neither, you're gonna trade 1 for 1, and these are the only 2 OPs left in the game. So basically that's what's gonna happen. Hanwha end up going for the Callista side, and which does bite T1 a little bit because they obviously are going to go for Skarner, and they're going to pick their matchup of the litter. And because so many champions are gone, the power of this Kalista and her bad matchups is actually even worse, right? So this Draven pick is actually what bites them a little bit, because it is the only remaining decent matchup, I would say, for the most part, that's like traditional, but it also locks T1 into a sort of specific type of composition or play style, right? They have to play around bot side. There's not even many supports that can pair well with this, right? Draven. I was thinking about what combos were left that could be okay with this. The only other ones would be things like Lucian Karma, Lucian and Milio, or like Lucian Nami or Zyra Khan, right? So instead, they opt for the Soraka route, which makes sense on paper, but does not make sense with a champ like Kalista, right? So that's where you get a bit of your catch-22, let's say, and especially from the perspective of trying to force lane. But now you can just kind of see like how awkward their comp is. So now Hanwha are like, okay, well, if they pick Draven, they're just gonna go forward, and that's the only way they can really win, because front to back we can just kind of outpace it. So they lock Talia. T1 say like, well, touche, well, we can pick Zoe, but then we have Draven, so it's like, oh, our comp's a little homeless. We don't really know what we want to do. So although this Hanwha life looks hella whack, it's actually fairly cohesive because of the way they've drafted around it, right? They've got solid FTB. They actually get a solid matchup into the Skarner pick, so they have a prepared pick, and then they blind Olaf. So they actually have solid lanes all around, right? T1, they're like, oh, yo guys, I have a good counter into Olaf. Let me go Akali here. But like, look at this comp. It's like this is like my solo queue game, right? It looks very, very chaotic, and I think this lack of cohesion in this last T1 draft is actually what threw this away. And I think this is actually completely lost on draft, in my opinion, because this Hanwha Life draft is way, way, way easier to play, even in spite of the potential for lane swap scenarios, right? And it just it's a little bit unfortunate, but you know, both teams being pushed to the absolute limits, you can kind of see the Hanwha like mindset going through in this game 5. So all in all, that's essentially like how the cookie crumbles for T1 in this case, and how they got eliminated from the LCK Cup. And I think you know, as good as T1 is, 2025, the competitive format with Fearless, crazy stuff. And I think T1 have got a great sort of program on their hands still. Nothing to knock there, but you can kind of see, you know, the flexibility here from Hanwha. The drafts are going a little bit crazy. You know, teams like players like Zeus are really able to be quite the asset in this meta, and I think this is actually something that teams should be factoring in moving forward in general, just to like for players to think about like how flexible are they in their pool, how willing are they to adapt to changes in the meta like this, and especially in Fearless. So that's essentially the lesson from the moral of today's draft analysis. So hopefully this is a fun journey to you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one. Hopefully this made sense to you guys.